Hello gang, Tattooed Biker here with you, and tonight I have 3 captivating stories to share straight from real life viewers who encountered fairies. Now our first story takes us to the bustling city of LA, where a woman and her friend witnessed tiny, glowing figures dancing among the branches of a tall tree, leaving them with a deep sense of inspiration and calm. Next, we journey to North Carolina, where an experiencer shares her encounters with different fey beings in her sister's house and at a nearby cemetery. She ponders if these mysterious creatures are somehow drawn to her, sparking both fear and fascination. Then our final story leads us to a camping trip in Kentucky, where a young man embarks on a hike with his father. In the depths of the forest, he comes face to face with a strange, dark figure. Could this have been a dark fairy? Well, we're wasting that moonlight, so you better grab your gear and let's ride. Number 1. Dear Mr. Biker, I stumbled across your channel and I've been enjoying listening to your videos for a few nights now. I do have some scary stories, but I thought I'd share a more uplifting story in case you're interested. This world is filled with many strange and unknown beings, and not all of them are bad. While living in Los Angeles in the late 90s, I had a friend that was a night owl like me, and we had many fun adventures while most everyone else had slept. We would often take walks in the middle of the night near home, and we never had any problems. In fact, some evenings were quite magical. This friend would also tell me some amazing tales that frankly were often hard to believe. Other people went so far as to call her a liar, but I thought of her as creative, and to be honest, I'd never actually caught her in a lie. It was just hard to believe that one person could have so many extraordinary experiences. So the night that she called to tell me that there were fairies in a tree outside of her house, I wasn't as shocked as you might think. She said that they'd been there for several nights, and she had tried to show them to other people, but they would hide until they left and then come out again. She thought that maybe they might come out for me. I didn't know what to expect exactly, but I figured it would be something that I could debunk, if only to myself. I went over there and we sat outside her house in my car and we just waited. There was a towering eucalyptus tree across the street from her house. This thing had to have been at least 40 feet tall. This was an older neighborhood, and LA does have some very large trees, contrary to popular belief. After about 10 minutes, she sits up and says, "There," pointing to a spot in the tree that was about 25 feet up in the air. I looked intently and started to see little lights moving on and around a huge branch. They were kind of dancing around and then resting back on the branch and then dancing around again. Not as a group, but much like individuals, mingling and dancing at a party. Well, that's the best way I can describe it. I think it's important to say that we weren't drinking or doing any kind of substances, and that I'm very familiar with fireflies and lightning bugs, which I've never seen in LA, from spending time in the South and having since lived in places where we get to see a lot of them. Whatever these were, they weren't fireflies. For one thing, their light was constant. It never flickered or dimmed. It was a bright white light, closer to the old school lights that you would put on a Christmas tree, but even brighter. It each had its own kind of glow. They also stayed close to each other the whole time and were constantly interacting. Looking back, I would guess there were about 10 of them, but I was so mesmerized at the time that I never thought to count them. They seemed, well, happy, and they truly gave off a feeling of goodwill and hope. I know it sounds crazy, but that's the best way I can describe it. They were definitely alive and aware and interacting with each other. Nothing like insects, and not in any kind of pattern. They also seemed to be aware that we were watching, and it was the closest thing to telepathy that I've ever experienced. They were welcoming and warm, despite their size gave off as much feeling as any person. I don't know how to describe it except that you know when you're dealing with sentient beings. It was like they represented the best of what we could be to ourselves and each other. I went back several nights in a row, and we would sit and watch them for hours until they all went dark together at a random time. I honestly felt honored that I had the chance to see them at all. Unfortunately, about a week after they first came, the city came and trimmed, aka butchered the trees on that street, and, well, they never came back. We were sad, but we knew we had gotten a glimpse into something special, so it remains a happy memory. Had you asked me before this if I believed in fairies, I would have said no. I still don't know exactly what they were, but I still think of these little guys and can't help but smile. I'm sure most people won't believe this or ever see fairies, but I thought I'd send it for the few who just might. Signed, Tracy. Number 2. Hey Biker, I've been watching your channel and I know that you are dedicated to spreading the awareness of unexplained phenomena and cryptid creatures. So I wanted to give a brief report of my encounters. I saw what I think was a brownie. It was about 2 inches long, tall, humanoid, but walked on all fours, with brown skin, brown clothes, and brown hair. It was walking on the floor and under my sister's bed. I jumped up and screamed, and I asked if they had any weird bugs in the area or any pets. She said no, and of course, it was gone a second later. I later saw one that had autumn-colored feathery wings under a different bed in that same house. It was also crawling on all fours, and I only saw the wings. It was also gone a moment later, and there was nothing under the bed with those colors. In the woods surrounding that house, we often heard the soft sound of tiny bells and quiet giggles coming from the trees. In a nearby cemetery, while visiting my grandpa's grave, a small, pale, flying humanoid zoomed past my head and off into the woods. I wanted to ask you if you think that these fae are attracted to certain people. I find it fascinating when you theorize that the Chicago winged humanoids might show themselves to only certain people. I wonder if the same may apply to the fae. All my experiences took place in Wilmington, North Carolina, by the way, near the ocean front. Thanks, Biker. Signed, Crystal. Number 3. Hey TB, I don't know to this day what it was exactly that I saw that night while camping in LBL, or land between the lakes in western Kentucky. Anyway, this all happened a bit over 2 decades ago when I was just 17 years old. My dad hunted, mainly bow hunting, and there regularly, and while I was never a hunter, I loved camping out in the woods. We never used any formal campsite back then. We'd drive along the trace and turn off into one of the numerous side roads, and then, near a creek bed, usually dry or just a small trickle from a spring unless it had rained, we had our usual campsite. We pulled the car off the road and set up the tent, tarp it all over angled, and Dad would do his thing while I would do mine. Now typically, if I went with him, that meant, and this time as well, he'd trek off to his stand and would be gone most of the day. While he was off, I'd hike a little bit. The LBL, while big, is not a place one could easily get lost in if you have basic survival skills. Read or just relax. For me, it was a place to go get away from it all and just get lost in nature. This early morning, he had left after a quick breakfast. A chill and dampness in the air and the smell of fall coming in. Any of the outdoor types will understand that smell of wet leaves during fall. I mention this only as because it'll be relevant later. Anyways, Dad had left and headed out for a very early morning hike. I set off in the usual direction, opposite from the road that we were near, mostly following the creek, but not along it directly. I had a compass if I needed it, but I never did. I had grown up in the Jackson Purchase, and it was home. I loved nature and never felt uncomfortable out in the woods. Before long, however, cresting a small hill, I heard rustling among the trees. While the leaves were starting to fall, most were still up. Fall at its absolute prettiest. I slowed, only for a moment. I'm used to those sounds. Squirrels typically, bounding from tree to tree, but then it got louder, heavier, unlike any sound that I've heard the trees make outside of them breaking under ice or age. It was hard to focus on the sound, like it was coming from all around me, but not. And in every direction I turned, I saw trees in the distance shaking, as if something large just jumped from them. But I never saw anything else. Despite years of being in the woods, I felt something that I never really had before. Fear. Not terror. That would come later, but actual fear. Almost as soon as it had started, the rattling, violent shaking of trees, it suddenly stopped. Nothing. Suddenly, no sound at all. Not quiet, exactly, but an absence, almost. Somehow, that relaxed me. I had been exposed to that stillness before, and while the violent rustling of multiple trees felt alien, this was familiar. I thought about going back until I saw in the distance, near the last tree that shook, a slim but dark figure. I couldn't make her out somehow. I felt that it was a female, because, the edges seemed, blurry. She was up near the ridge ahead, and I felt compelled to head to her, and I did. I know that sounds crazy, and typing it down now, I still do, but then I just rationalized it, as I wonder if she heard all that too. Perhaps she saw what it was. But as I walked towards her, she slid away, staying just barely visible among those trees. The sky was just starting to really lighten up. That transition, from dawn into morning. And slid was the right word, I feel. She moved what appeared to be normal, but the distance that she seemed to cover was unnatural. I'm tall, at over 6 feet tall, but my strides covered half the distance that hers did, and she seemed normal-sized. As normal-sized as a dark, featureless shape could be, I mean. I could see a head, arms, legs, and what appeared to be dark but normal clothing, but for some reason I just couldn't track her. Focusing on her was hard, and outside of knowing it was a female, I could tell nothing else as she disappeared and reappeared among the trees, a few hundred yards ahead of me, walking slowly yet somehow covering distances at running speeds. Again, I don't know why I followed her, but I did, down a hill and through some fog until I neared a clearing. I lost sight of her as I neared it, and things got darker, like when the sun crawls behind a dense cloud, except there were none out that I could see. Though the sun was still too low for me to catch, the stillness, familiar, was there, but that didn't bother me. It was the smell that did. Every step closer to the clearing, I noticed it more and more, and though I couldn't find her, and I desperately wanted to find her, it sent alarm bells all through me. I've been, both before and since, in the woods hundreds of times. One thing I have never experienced since that weekend was the complete absence of smell. Nature has a smell. Not a stink, but one that is distinct. One of decay and life, and of plants and trees and creeks and stagnant ponds. And while depending on where you are, you may or may not smell the same odors, except this time there was nothing. That lack slowed me, stopped me, and only then did I see her across that clearing, looking at me. I wish I could say that she was giant and hairy or an alien gray, but she looked normal, indistinct, and unmemorable, except for her smile. When she smiled, I ran. I had been scared before with the trees out in the middle of the LBL, but that lack of any smell, sound, and, well, that smile, it terrified me, and I ran. I was crying and terrified, and I had no idea why I should be. I stopped about halfway back, and everything was brighter, and despite my terror, I still wanted to turn back. I did look back, and though she was just a shape again, she was there, closer, freezing as soon as I spotted her. A smile again, but one I felt and didn't see. And again I ran, all the way back to the tent. I got in, zipped it up, and just cried, shaking in a terror that I did not and could not understand. I stayed in that tent until my dad got back, and I didn't tell him about it. By then, the terror had faded, and while I couldn't explain it, I knew something horrible would have happened had I gone into the dark clearing that had no smells or no sound. By night, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined it all. When stepping away from the tent to relieve myself, that stillness came over, and I froze. I looked among the trees and saw nothing until I saw two reddish lights moving off in the distance. I knew the terrain, and I knew it had to be uphill for me, but the eyes were descending. I felt her, in the same sense I had felt it was a woman earlier, coming my way, and I felt a smile that wasn't a smile, even though I couldn't see it. I ran back to the tent, and my dad was there, staring into the fire, and when I yelled at him, he just sat there, not responding. I shook him, still feeling those eyes from that thing behind me, and then even the fire had no smell to it. It was just nothing. I shook my dad harder, screaming at him, and then suddenly the fire was crackling and I could smell smoke. The stillness was gone, and my dad asked me what the hell I was yelling about. And when I told him, he gave me that sideways glance that said, "Are you okay?" After much pressuring, we left, and while I barely held it together, as soon as I got in my room in our house, I cried. Not because I had embarrassed myself, but because of relief. I knew for a fact, had I not reached my dad and had not shaken him, that I would have just wandered off in the dark. Just like I would have wandered off in the morning, following her. She wanted me in that clearing, which it just all felt wrong and smelled of nothing. And I wonder, and have wondered so many nights, what would have happened. I probably and hopefully will never have an answer. I just pray that I never see or feel her again. I've been in the woods since then, both near there and in other woods, and I've never felt that way again. But still, every time the woods get quiet, I get a little scared. I don't know if any of this applies here, but I hope you might understand. It's followed me for over 2 decades, and I don't know how the hell you can feel a smile, but that was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I had to get it out. Thanks for reading. Signed, Henry. And there it is. 3 reports of fairy encounters from viewers, just like you. So what are your thoughts about these? I'm anxious to read your theories and opinions in the comments below, but please, keep it respectful to the witnesses. And if you have an encounter or an unexplained experience that, well, you'd like to share, just send it to the email address in the description, and your story may just wind up in a future video. Anyways, thanks for riding with me tonight. I sure do appreciate it. And until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker out.